Welcome to Monday's Q&A on February 24th. It's a pleasure to have you all here. And just as a couple of opening comments, I'm Dr. Debra Dupree, the Mindset Doc, and with me is Felicia Amenta from the San Diego County Office of Education and the Joint Powers Authority program. And, we, in our announcement of this program, we did outline 5 key topics. And so we will be framing our conversation throughout the course of our next 45 minutes along those topics. And we're going to sort of mix it up a little bit because there are some quickies that we want to deal with, and then there are some really hot topics that we want to deal with. And then also do encourage you at any time. I will be monitoring the chat room if you have any questions that surface about what's going on. We have some examples to share with you, of course, maintaining confidentiality. And again, the world keeps changing and the rules keep changing and guidelines keep changing. We just learned of a new guideline changing this morning at a major school district, so you'll learn more about that. A couple of things, we are also recording. And so as a follow-up, for those of you who have joined us in the past, we will be sending up a follow-up email with the recording so that you can attach it and share it with others. And there will also be a one-page resource that Felicia will share with you to give you further links. And sometimes other links come forth too. And so again, do watch for that follow-up email. Okay. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get going. And again, welcome, Felicia.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here, Deborah. It's always one of my favorite things to do.
Oh, great. I certainly engage the dialogue with you, and we keep learning, don't we?
Yes. Staying calm is very important.
Very important, very important. And on that note, I will just say, what's tough for so many people is, anytime we have unpredictability, uncertainty, the unexpected, it can cause a state of anxiousness. And then when we get anxious, we don't engage and communicate as effectively, and then we feel unstable. And certainly the world has been a bit unstable, and so it's a challenge. And so remaining calm and making sure you're taking care of yourself and whatever the throes of chaos are is critically important. So always think about what you can do to take care of yourself, and then you'll impact others positively around you. So very good. So, Felicia, a few things here. Ongoing changes given the surge, and what to do when testing positive. That's where we'll start. And I'm just very happy that both you and I have stayed healthy throughout all of this.
It's an amazing thing, right? I've been working virtually. I've done a few in-person meetings, but for the most part, I've been working virtual since the pandemic. But right, so many of our school district employees are sick with Omicron due to the surge.
And varying levels of symptoms too, depending on whether they're vaccinated or not vaccinated.
Yeah, we have some employees with mild symptoms, and then we have some employees that are in the hospital that are very, very ill with Omicron. So the idea, that it can't really make you sick, it's not true, right? Just depends on the person and the circumstances.
Right. So what are maybe 2 or 3 key changes that you really see most relevant, most pertinent to our conversation today?
Well, when I think back on all the questions that I've been asking, so when we came back from break on January 3rd, and then some of the districts didn't come back until the 10th, we really had a lot of questions about entering positive COVID-19 tests into the portal. A lot of the districts were saying, well, we were closed on break, so nobody was working on site, so we don't need to report anything into the portal. And so I had to do a lot of clarification that from the date of the positive test, when you look at 14 days prior to that test, any day of those 14 days, a lot of districts were saying, well, they have to work all 14 of the days before the positive test. And I said, no, any day. So if it's 1 day or 2 days, or if it was before the break, but it's still within the 14 days, then you have to enter that positive COVID test into your TPA's COVID portal within 3 business days of your knowledge. Some of the school districts had 103 per day employees that were testing positive for COVID. So this was an overwhelming task, and they had to get some help just with the entering into the TPA site. The second issue that...
So let me just clarify. I want to make sure that our listeners and viewers understand this. So even with the holiday closures and stuff like that, the guidelines require that if you have a positive COVID test, then you have to report anybody ill with 14 days prior to the test. Is that what?
The date of the test, not the date of the test results, because right now test results are 5 and 6 days behind in some instances. It's the date that they tested positive.
Okay. And going back 14
results.
days then.
And going back 14 days. And you're right, if they did not work on site on any of those 14 days, then it does not need to be reported to the state into the COVID portal. And another question that's come up a lot is surrounding the rapid tests or the antigen tests versus the PCR tests. So I want to clarify this because it's really been a topic of confusion, and we had to go to our JPA panel attorneys to get some clarification. The schools we are using for our isolation and quarantine rapid testing, obviously, because that's what's available right now and what's being sent out, to the school districts to utilize, and what people can get, right? It's difficult. It became very difficult when we came back on the 3rd after the surge, and there was so much community spread that a lot of our employees were sick with COVID. And so while the schools are using the rapid antigen testing, and what we always recommend, another question that we've been getting is, do we give everyone a claim form that tests positive for COVID? Well, that's not what you have to do, right? But what we do recommend that you do is if an employee says that I think I was exposed at work, that's all they need to say. They don't need to say, I want to file a comp claim. Can you give me a claim form? They don't even know what those words mean or what that is. Then our recommendation is that you give them a claim form and advise them of the right to file a claim and refer them to occupational medicine provider. If they tested positive with an antigen test in the workers' comp presumed compensable law, it says that you need to test positive with a PCR test. So we have had some work comp claims where they said, I think I was exposed at work, and they gave them a claim form, and then they reported the claim to the work comp TPA, and the work comp TPA said, well, you had an antigen test or a rapid test, which we don't utilize. You need to get a PCR test. And we had an example of a person who did just that. They had a rapid test, they tested positive. They tried to get an appointment for like 9 days, right over the surge. You couldn't get appointments anywhere. And they finally got an appointment for a PCR test. It was like 10 or 11 days later, and they tested negative, of course, right?
Okay.
They tested negative. And so the claims team, we had a lot of discussion about that with our JPA panel attorney, because they, were positive on the antigen, but obviously the immunity, had dropped. And so by the time they had the PCR test, they were negative. And so we had a lot of discussion about denying claims just based on the differences in the testing. And what our JPA panel attorneys are telling us is that if the antigen test is the only test available and that's what's being utilized, and then obviously we're doing isolation and quarantine based on those rapid tests, we're going to look at all those cases on a case-by-case basis. We do want them to follow up with a PCR test. We do, if they're going to file a comp claim, and the TPA will have that discussion with the employees. But there's been a lot of discussion about that.
Yeah, so I mean, I have to admit, I had some lack of clarity about that as well, because I did get sick earlier in the month, and it's like, I don't know if I have COVID or not, but it really feels like a cold. And I couldn't get my hands on one, and by the time I got them, I was already much, much better. So,
Yes.
But because of the way the symptoms ran, I pretty am clear. But I just had a COVID test yesterday and was negative. So I just want to clarify something, but go ahead.
We were talking, there has been a lot of discussion and questions at the district that the rapid tests or the antigen tests aren't very reliable. And in talking with some of the doctors and the toxicologists and immunologists that we work with on the claims side, one of the things that they clarified for me yesterday, which was really helpful, was that on the antigen or the rapid test, if you test positive, that has a very high probability, that you're positive. If on the antigen test, sometimes if it's early, you can test negative, but they want you to follow up with a PCR test. And then a lot of times you'll test positive. Just because of the time delay and the sensitivity in picking up, and that the PCR test is more reliable on picking up the, the virus.
Right. So just to summarize what you said then is that on your weekly testing, you are using the rapid test and the antigen test because they're quick results, you get them right away. But if somebody tests positive and then they feel that they also got it at work, then a PCR test is required.
So for our weekly testing, we're talking about two different things, I guess.
Okay. Okay.
On our, if you're not vaccinated, if you're unvaccinated and if you're on a weekly testing program,
Okay.
at least at 𝐷𝐞𝐬𝐸, you're going to the county. You're using a county site and you're having a PCR test done. But you're right, it has been difficult. You have to wait in line for a long time recently, and test results have been really coming back late. We're talking about people who are reporting positive COVID coming back from the break or, on any day, and they took a rapid test at home or a home test they had.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, it has been confusing, and certainly access has been difficult. Yeah. But I think it's already changing. They say that we're, probably hit the height already and coming back down, because I did just have a test on Saturday and I had the results yesterday within 30 hours. So
getting better. Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very happy about that. You know what happened? We opened up for the most part in the middle of a major community surge, right? And so then we had literally hundreds of employees and school staff that tested positive for COVID. And then the people that are responsible for the isolation and the contact tracing got overwhelmed, right? With the deluge of emails. And that's why I always say that I have to stay completely calm in my job, because everybody that I'm dealing with is completely overworked. Usually has been the last 2 or 3 weeks have been a little rough. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Well, a couple of comments before we move on then, Felicia. Well, actually 3. And I don't want to take a lot of time up, but we talked about staff and employees and so forth, but have we seen this kind of surge in the students themselves?
The students are getting Omicron too. But certainly I don't get all the phone calls about that, right? The school districts are dealing with it, and the charter schools. But it's the employees, right, that I get all the calls and questions about.
Right. Okay. And then, another thing too is, and this has been going on for quite a while with COVID, we all have our job descriptions and our assigned duties, but because of all of the new requirements, through Cal OSHA and OSHA, et cetera, that people are suddenly doing, tasks that they didn't normally do. And so there's been a lot of reallocation and sometimes new hiring and so forth. A couple things I'll share with you about that. Just from a neurological perspective is that, when you go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Take some deep breaths, and if you can walk away from it for 30 minutes or even a little longer, just the physiology of your brain will settle down and you'll be able to think through, okay, what are some alternatives? And I just coached a few people on that last week working around, medical conditions in the workplace. It's like, okay, thanks for bringing this up to date. Let's come back to this later this afternoon when we have a chance to sort of mull over what's going on. And I realize, time frames are tight, but sometimes the response or reaction in the moment is not the best one. So, yeah. And so, one of the things, the idea of flexibility and resiliency is really key to continuing to go through this. But it is also a great opportunity to provide temporary alternative work to keep people working who can't do their usual jobs due to a medical condition. And so that's a whole new opportunity that's emerging in a couple of districts I work with, and really starting to advocate that more, because we don't know when this is going to go away, and we don't want to burn out the people we've got doing it.
Right.
Yep. Well, if you have any questions, viewers and listeners, don't hesitate to put them in the chat box. But one of the things that we've come up to, aside from COVID, is when we have temporary medical conditions that may require the use of assistive devices, and the impact that has on someone's ability to be at work and perform the work. And those are still key notions under the ADA: be at work, stay at work, and perform the work. And the EEOC does advocate temporary accommodations. And so I think what we want to address then is that what are some of the liability and direct threat aspects of people using assistive devices, and like crutches, oxygen tanks. I know I've had a couple situations about using wheelchairs, and how does that impact? And so I'd like to have you share a couple examples and just a reminder of viewers and listeners of what the ADA already says.
We've had a couple of interesting cases come up, and these have been work comp cases, but they easily could have been non-industrial disabilities too. We had one employee at a district who injured their ankle foot pretty severely, and they had to use crutches, right? Because they needed to stay off that foot. And so the note, interestingly enough, the note that went over to the district, and it went over to the site, right, to the site secretary for the principal to look at. And it didn't go to the district office, so they didn't even know about this, right? And so it just stated on it that the person couldn't do a lot of lifting, pushing, and pulling. And it didn't even mention crutches. They didn't even know about the crutches, right? So the site secretary talked to the principal, and he looked at the restrictions, and she's an instructional aide in a mod severe special ed class. And the principal said, yes, we can do that. You know, we can make these temporary accommodations, tell her to come back to work on Monday. Right? And this was on a Friday. So she shows up on Monday and she's on crutches, and she's got all these special ed kids all around her running around, and it's a little chaotic. And she called me because she called the union first, and then she called me, and she said, I don't think I should be working here. I don't feel safe. I think it's unsafe. I feel like I tried to crutch to the bathroom and all the kids are around me, and in the classroom, I feel like I'm going to fall over. Is this right? And so then you're right. I said, thank you for the input. I'm going to reach back out to your district. She should have called HR at her district, or the people that handle risk, but I said, that's fine. I will get you to the right people. And so I immediately contacted the treating doctor because she told me where she was going. And and then I contacted the district, and they said, no, the note doesn't say anything about crutches. Let me send you the note. And then when I look at the note, you're right. I said, why does this not say anything about crutches? She's in a mod severe special ed class with pretty needy children that are running around her while she's on these crutches. And so then that went back to the treating doctor at 𝐻𝐸ZR on the job. And then 𝐻𝐸ZR on the job clarified, yes, when they have assistive devices, whether it's one of the Rolly devices for a knee injury, or whether it's crutches, or temporarily in a wheelchair, or with an oxygen tank, which we don't see a lot in workers' comp, but we see a lot in the non-industrial, there should be something on the note that's part of the accommodation. They need to have the oxygen tank nearby, or wearing it, or they need to be in a wheelchair, or they need to be on crutches in the classroom, right? Along with the no lifting, no pushing, pulling over 20 pounds or whatever it was. So then we got a corrected note, and then the site principal looked at that, and then the district, and then I defer, of course, to the district to make that decision whether or not they can temporarily accommodate that. But it's interesting because just the use of assisted devices, what I was explaining to the treating doctor, is an accommodation also that the district has to be aware of, so that they can make a decision on, is it safe, right? Because that's something that we have to decide. As employers.
Right. Yeah. There are a couple key things about that, because, again, the whole thrust of the ADA and FEHA is to return employees to work as soon as reasonably medically possible. And it's better to keep people at work doing something than at home. There's a whole mindset that settles in if they're off work too long. But, if you take a look at, even from the Department of Labor and all these different agencies, FMLA and so on, Office of Disability Guidelines, all of them, emphasize the importance of keeping people at work, because when people are off work, again, the whole mindset goes in. The longer they're off work, the statistics go up as far as people never returning to work. But then there's a whole socioeconomic impact on, their lifestyles and stuff like that when people are on disability too long. And then that's what we want to avoid, when we talk about Social Security disability benefits and
right.
On and on and on. So going back to the current situation then is that, and this is where more education to employees, but certainly to our site administrators, is that, if everything is still on a case-by-case basis. That's what the law says. And so, it's like, and this is where educating employees when they have a condition, then as far as, make sure you take your job description to your doctor. Make sure you talk about the work environment with your doctor. And because I've had a situation where someone may be using crutches, but is there something alternative that they can use when in the classroom so they don't present the risk? And so it's really, again, exploring options, different approaches, making sure, a lot of doctors, even OCMED doctors, to some degree, don't understand the world of work, don't understand the impact of what these limitations might mean. And so it's always, again, on a case-by-case basis, whether you do a formal interactive process, using somebody like me, or doing it internally, at least have having that conversation and not just taking it at face value. And so that's something we're going to be talking about, Felicia, in my program at the SDCOE coming up on February 1st with all the HR people.
And, you know, the end of that story was that the doctor's note did talk a little bit about the crutches, and then the site principal sat down with the instructional assistant and special ed, and they did work out a situation where they could have her safely work with the crutches. So we were able to keep her there. It was just that, you know, there was some information missing when they even made the decision to bring her back to work.
Right. And the other part of that thing too is to take a look at what kind of temporary, modified, or alternative work. You know, a lot of school districts will have special projects going on, and certainly during the COVID times when people are having to do all kinds of special tasks, but to, you know, maybe put that person on a temporary accommodation while they're using the crutches. Crutches is not a long-term thing, it's temporary.
Right.
Wheelchairs may be temporary, long-term. And so one example I'll share is we had a teacher, and was on a campus that had lots of slopes and so forth, and she developed a lower extremity problem, and so she elected to use a wheelchair. In fact, her doctor did support it. You know, she may use a wheelchair on the workplace, and so the employee went out and got it because it was not a work-related injury. The problem came though is she was on the heavier side, and it was a manual wheelchair. And so what she would do is she would ask her coworkers or co-teachers to push her from one location to another, and now we were placing them at risk for further harm and injury. And so it was like the wheelchair wasn't inappropriate; it was the use of other people to get from point A to point B. And so, you know, you need to talk to your doctor. This is not going to be okay. We did take her off of work temporarily until she, so she was incentivized to talk to her doctor about getting a prescription for an electric wheelchair. That's all the problem. Okay. But you do have to look at the, you know, the direct threat elements. And again, under the ADA, it applies to the person themselves with the medical condition, but also, are we creating risk or injury for others around? And so use of crutches in a special ed classroom would definitely create a risk, you know, because of, you know, young children and moving around, et cetera.
Right, and that's why I took that as a rush item, and it got elevated right away. And you know why? She went to the union. That's what happened. She went to the union right away and said, I'm not safe in the classroom. And then they directed her to call me, you know, and because they know that I'm over the workers' comp. And then I was able to get in and help, but I considered that on fire, right? Yeah. Because she was at work when she was calling me, and I could hear all the little kids around her while she was on her crutches. So always, you know, to our viewers and listeners, again, always take into consideration when you get a set of medical guidelines from a doctor. Okay, got it. Now let's talk about the work environment. Let's talk about the position. You know, who else may be impacted by these kinds of things. And again, temporary is one thing, long-term is another. But the long-term doesn't kick in until someone's at maximum medical improvement. But I always think short-term, how to keep people back at work. We're already short-staffed enough. And so we need everybody that can work that possible. Yeah. Now, another interesting thing that comes up a lot, and you and I see it all the time, and I'm sure some of our participants have too, but when you get those medical guidelines for somebody who's experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety, this person can no longer work for this supervisor. What? You know, oh my God, what do you mean? You know, tell us why. And so that is a provision under of the ADA again. It's like, okay, we get it, but we have to understand why. You know, what are the behavioral factors or the engagement in this relationship that create problems for this employee? Because we could, if we don't know that, if we don't explore that, we could be inadvertently placing someone into another work environment with a new supervisor. Guess what? That could have the same kind of personality features as the last one. And so now we've actually increased the person's direct threat per risk or injury for further harm. So I know you and I have had lots of conversations. We've talked about some of the psychologists involved. And I oftentimes get involved writing to doctors and psychologists as another psychologist saying, thank you very much, but we need more information here. So what do you suggest to our participants here around that? It's been really difficult. We've been, from the workers' comp side, when we see psych or stress claims, because stress is everywhere and stress needs to be over 51% of the work responsibility in order for that claim to be picked up in the work comp system. So while we're going through that process of determining causation, the person is usually treating with a, MPN psychologist or a psychiatrist, depending on if they need medication or not. The most difficult restrictions that we usually get on psych stress claims, almost always, they're taking them out of work altogether so that they can get treatment and kind of calm everything down while they're getting care. But that's not what we see most often. They try to keep them at work and keep them engaged, to your point, but they want to remove them from the person that they feel is a direct threat to them. Right. And when I say they, I mean the injured employee. And so usually the notes that we see are cannot work at or around Mr. or Mrs. X. It's like removal from a person. Yeah. That is a very difficult work restriction on a temporary or a permanent basis for a school district to deal with. We also see cannot work around student Miss or Mr. X, or cannot in their classroom, like the student would have to be removed or they'd have to be removed, right? Those are also very difficult to accommodate. And then we also see cannot work alongside or in the department with X. And that's usually a colleague or a coworker, usually a close coworker that's in, but it's usually someone that works pretty close to them.
Right.
And
so,
then,
Felicia, can I add real quickly, because I've even had a couple of cases where the for example, a teacher could not have exposure to the parent of a child.
These so are all, yes. Whereas a parent can come on and pick up their kid, or they might have to have a parent-teacher conference. So these are very difficult things. But I have met with the psychologists and the psychiatrists that we have on our MPN that are all excellent. They're excellent, just trying to do their best work. Yeah. And what they tell me is we're trying to keep them at work, but we want to keep them away from the person that made this whole thing blow up and start, so that we can kind of treat them and calm things down. But I told them these kinds of restrictions, removing them from students, removing them from their boss, removing them from their work setting, are very difficult, almost impossible for a lot of the districts to work with, because they're not really telling us what's actually wrong or what the disability is, so we can put them somewhere else safely, right? Yeah. So it makes it very difficult to accommodate. And because their comment to me was, why don't the school districts adhere to these restrictions and just put them in a different department for a while we kind of calm things down? And I said, it's much more complicated than that. We can't just pull kids out of classrooms. We certainly can't refuse the right of parents to come on to, a campus when their children are attending school there. And one of the restrictions I saw a while ago was the employee could not be around the superintendent at or near, so that the superintendent couldn't come on to a school site, as if, right? That's their actual job, is to be over all the school sites. So I think a lot of times our treating doctors don't realize how difficult those restrictions are to accommodate.
Yeah. And one thing, here I just advocated bringing people back to work on temporary accommodation as soon as reasonably possible. But as a psychologist, I also do provide one-on-one services to people, oftentimes through EAP programs. And so I just did have a case, on the private side, where an employee had tried to work with her HR. Again, it's a public agency. Other people had already left her department over the preceding 3 years because of difficulty with this one manager. And again, she tried to work with HR as far as some of the difficulties and challenges, and she did ask to be temporarily relocated until she could, get things settled down. Well, they refused. They kept her where she was. Well, that wasn't helping her at all either. I mean, she was experiencing significant physical symptoms as a result of the stress and so in that case, and there are some other temporary conditions, taking someone off of work for 30 days to let things settle down and to sort of let them get the treatment and maybe further recover before we evaluate a return to temporary or long-term accommodation is often the best way to go. And I have taken people off of work because trying to work with them staying in the work condition situation has not helped them improve. And the only thing I can do is remove them from the stressors or the potential harm or injury. So,
right, and I agree. And like you and I always talk about, and I always talk about this with our member districts, that if you're having this kind of a struggle and there isn't a place that you think you can put this person safely because you don't really have very much information on what it is that is the problem, if if their work comp claim is in delay and it's not accepted yet, then usually they're using their sick leave if they cannot come back to work. And if the work comp claim is accepted, then they're going to be paid the workers' comp TD 2/3. That's what they're going to be getting.
Right.
So, and then the district's going to be applying, their benefits, beyond that. But so it is, they're complicated situations, but I always tell the districts, you have to make your best decision on whether or not you can accommodate.
Yeah, yeah. And again, I would remind people, because it's really easy when we get this unexpected information, go, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But again, keep in mind the processes you already have in place for temporary accommodation, long-term accommodation, and follow them. We've been thrown a lot of, curveballs over the last couple of years. And I know I've said in many of my IPMs with the school districts, some of whom are here, I've been doing this work since 1994, and shortly after the ADA was passed, and I've never seen so many changes in EEOC guidance and oh my gosh, than I have in the last 2 years. And I know how much research we're always doing to stay abreast of what's happening. So, and so that's why, a friendly consult is always helpful, but, take a moment to deep breathe and.
Yes. The one thing I think that's really important to remember when you get a note, the particular example of the person with the supervisor that they couldn't work at or near the supervisor, this went on for months. This went on for 4 or 5 months, and they didn't have an IPM. And that's the one thing I would change. If this is going on a long time and you can't accommodate that at or near the supervisor, and that is not changing from the treater, then you need to meet and have a dialogue. What are we going to do? What's our long-term strategy? How can we help you? If we don't know exactly where else to place you and you refuse to work with the supervisor anymore and the doctor has prohibited you from working with the supervisor, what's our game plan? What are we going to do? Do we have any other jobs available for you? So you still need to engage because, again, like I always say, the litigation on this is not in workers' comp. It is over in civil side. Failure to accommodate, failure to meet, failure to interact, disability discrimination, wrongful termination. That's where the danger, the rocks lie. So you want to make sure that you're not sitting on your notes, that you're really meeting and engaging with your notes.
And if I can add to that, because on the civil side, it's $300,000 per claim that is found valid. Okay. So it could be a very expensive outcome. And so, and particularly in the education system where you have those 5 months or 100 days of half pay, you want to make sure you have that IPM well before you get to
run out of leave.
Because now you have actually caused a loss of income in addition to the failure to accommodate. And so, use your 90-day mark, when you've got a tricky, difficult situation. And if anything, you use it to educate the employee about, the laws that apply and where to go and things like that. That will go a long way in protecting any, or not, I shouldn't say protecting, but minimizing or reducing, mitigating any liability you might have because you're showing a good faith effort to be proactive. So, yeah. Well, we're going to move on. And if people have questions, feel free, because this is again, a big topic, but I want to get to the Supreme Court actions and OSHA recommendations. It's probably the biggie, and we're starting to run out of time here. But and just a quick note before we go there. I have been doing a lot of research around religious exemptions, around the vaccine and things like this. And again, it's an evolving target, but again, the guidelines have always been there, but it's how do we apply it in this COVID situation? So we're going to come back to that one because I do have some things in progress, and not all school districts are confronted with the rising number of claims for religious exemptions. Some are not at all. So I'll get back to you with our next meeting in February with more information on that. But Felicia, what's happening with the Supreme Court and OSHA today?
So as probably everybody knows on this call, the Supreme Court made a decision to overturn the Fed OSHA vaccine mandate for large employers over 100, with over 100 employees. That didn't affect, us in California in the school environment that are still mandating vaccines for our school employees or testing weekly. Supreme Court, the Fed OSHA was basically going to expand what we're already doing to all other employers, but we have been doing it since October. So we are well into that. After the Supreme Court made their decision. A lot of the private employers had to make their own decisions. It left everybody kind of up in the air to their own devices. I made some notes. Citibank is keeping their vaccination mandates. They're holding steady and proceeding ahead. General Electric and Starbucks, as many people know, they dropped their plans to mandate vaccines or tests pretty much right after the Supreme Court made their decision. And that makes sense, right? Because they're in multiple states where the states sometimes aren't even giving them any cover. They're actually even legislating against vaccine mandates. So the employers have to navigate an increasingly complicated and sometimes contradictory patchwork kind of federal, state, and local measures. The 𝐀𝐠𝐢𝐥𝐞 guidance came out and due on 1/19/22, and we'll attach a little, there's a new fact sheet that's one page that's really easy on isolation and quarantine. And that is the new California Department of Public Health isolation and quarantine guidance. It came out on January 6th, 22, right after we came back from school, which overrides some of the 𝐀𝐀 COVID-19 emergency temporary standards in certain circumstances. And those are it's a really quick guideline on changes. And you know what they did? They adopted some changes that went into, because the CDC guidelines changed in December, reducing the number of days that people isolate after being infected from to 5 from 10 in certain circumstances with if they show no symptoms. And so then, what happened was 𝐀𝐀 put out new guidance and a kind of a little one-page fact sheet, and it sort of says if you test positive for COVID, if you're exposed to someone that tests positive, and it kind of tells you when to quarantine, no quarantine, and what the isolation periods are. And it's a really nice fact sheet that they sent out. I want to say it's dated 1/19/22, and it also has kind of frequently asked questions in it. But I felt like it was really helpful. Certainly what 𝐷𝐞𝐬, the county office, got a large supply of N95 masks from the state last week, and M&O, our maintenance and operations, is sending those out to the school districts on a rush basis. And then LA Unified this morning just changed their mask mandate, so no children can come in with just cloth masks. They have it doesn't actually just say a surgical mask, but it is a type of mask that goes over your nose. It's a very specific guideline. So their mask mandate is still, the same. Their mask mandate is more strict, I'll say, than in San Diego County. In the LA, it applies when the kids are outside or inside, outdoors, indoors. And, they have a vaccine mandate with no testing policy. You must be vaccinated to work on all LA Unified campuses, period, if you're a school employee. But now for the children today, the mask mandate changed. So it's very interesting, what's happening with COVID. It evolves and then it changes as we're learning more about it. But I think because Omicron's the spread of it, it's so much more transmissible, right? That's what allowed the surge. So that's why we're seeing, I think, some of the changes in guidance. But it's hard to keep up to date on everything between the Department of Health for California and then our local guidelines and then the CDC and 𝐀𝐀𝐢𝐥𝐿. It's been challenging.
Yes, at most, yes. And so, what I've heard is the N95 or the KN95, which were made in Korea. But the way they're designed actually filters out some of the virus that can otherwise transmitted, and even the layered masks are not doing that. So that's why the shift now with this Omicron is very important. And I know one of the things that we in our announcement for today's program, as many of you may or may not know, is that the federal government has now just released free rapid tests and antigen tests, and so there are a couple different websites, and I provided one in our announcement where you can order up to 4 tests per household. Is it per household or per person?
Per address.
Per address.
My understanding. Per address. The 4 go to the address.
Yeah, so now those are available complimentary and really easy to do. So, use that link that we sent out if you haven't already done that. And then there's another link too. But again, take advantage of it and make sure we've got our tests, because we don't know. An example from early COVID is that somebody didn't want to come back on work until the mask requirement was no longer, existed. It's like, but we have no idea when that's going to be, so that's not a viable accommodation. We know you've been doing it for a couple, 2-3 months, and that was early in COVID. And so I had to take a look at, well, how do we get her back to work? Or we've got some options.
The other new things that came out and that I'm also watching closely too is the Biden administration's new rule on the testing that private insurers have to cover the cost of, I think it's 8 COVID tests per month. I was reading that this morning just to make sure that I was right about that. But that's also a new rule that's coming into play. That's for health insurers, right? And then also the issue is being discussed quite a bit now about what fully vaccinated means versus keeping up to date and being optimally protected, right? Fully vaccinated in our world, as far as, or you get tested weekly, is just having the 2 vaccine shots. It does not include having a booster. But there's been a lot of discussion now about whether they're going to expand what the definition of being fully vaccinated is. Because the vaccines wane over time, right? Not the same for everyone. So I'm watching that space because it hasn't changed yet. We still, as far as 𝐥𝐞𝐬𝐨 and a lot of our school districts, fully vaccinated means 2 vaccines, that's fully vaccinated. And if you are not fully vaccinated, then you're doing your weekly testing regimen, like everyone. But it'll be interesting. I'm watching that space closely because I'm now thinking that the definition of fully vaccinated might change in the future. So,
well, I would definitely concur with that because this is so recent, folks, that just as of last week, these are the kinds of discussions being held in the scientific communities. Because I actually heard, a couple of prominent medical scientists talking about, fully vaccinated does mean including the booster, and so. If I recall the stats, about low 70% of American population is vaccinated, but only about 55% has the boosters. And again, those change all the time. But so another piece of the evolving world as we're dealing with COVID. And so, we started off this Q&A, back in 2020 before this even started. And so we were just, covering a wide range of elements of the interactive process. But now, as you can see, the interactive process definitely includes all of those elements of COVID, vaccinations, testing, protocols in schools and things like that. And so it's just going to be an ongoing shifting world here. And so
I applaud the schools so much because I just think with a lot of COVID fell into HR, risk, and then safety people. And then they were responsible for this whole extra layer of work on top of all the education work that we were already doing. So really been doing a great job.
Yeah, I commend them too, because they really have stayed up on top. And so, with that, I want to thank all of our participants today. And if you aren't regularly subscribed to get notification, I know that Felicia does send them out to her network as well. Please do so, because we're going to continue doing this. Sometimes the dates change if Monday is a holiday. And so just be flexible, but you can sign up for all of the scheduled ones available when you sign up and indicate. We'll keep you posted if the dates do change. But again, we're always welcoming questions. We know we don't get out of everything in our short 45 minutes, but we do want to be mindful of our time because we've reached that moment. And as a reminder, again, there will be a follow-up email, generally in about 3 to 4 days, of where we include the link to the recording as well as the one-page overview that Felicia talked about, giving some new guidance and about isolation and quarantine. And, we hope to keep continuing to be a resource to you. And again, feel free to reach out to Felicia or me with any questions that come out and as things go along, because the more we communicate, the more we learn from one another and the more we can stay on top of these rapidly changing circumstances. So Felicia, thank you again for being part of this. Thank you to everybody who's participating today. And thank you for everyone who listens to our future recording. We will see you again in another month.
Be well, everyone.